Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Mops and Mo's. Tonight it's just Alex and myself. We've done now several episodes on endurance. We did a how to, more or less, for programming for endurance. So tonight we thought we would take a little bit of a different route and talk about programming for strength.
Back to basics, baby.
Back to basics. So it's another one of those kind of X's and O's whiteboard chats, and we're going to do it through the lens of some pretty basic strength principles and then just kind of riff on how we might change things up for people that want to combine, endurance work with strength. Some of the research out there, we won't get, well, we might, but the intent is not to get super deep into the weeds on some of this stuff, but rather to kind of highlight or walk folks through how a program would be put together, focusing specifically on strength.
But I think something we will inevitably do here as we set it up is bash a little bit on things that are like accepted foundational concepts that turn out to be either like outdated or misleading when you actually get into it.
Yeah, so grab a pen, piece of paper, and enjoy. Music, music, music. Hey guys, real quick, recognizing that an episode talking about the X's and O's of strength training can be a little bit hard to follow, we thought that we would have a blog post that will accompany this episode. So by the time you're hearing this, you can head over to mopsandmos.com, check out our blog. You will see a programming for strength post that is going to walk through pretty much the same stuff that we're talking about in this episode, but it'll give you the chance to actually see it as opposed to just listening and trying to follow along.
And since this particular approach to programming that Drew lays out in the conversation you're about to hear lends itself pretty well to like visual depictions, it has some like 3x3 charts and things like that. I will be dropping an Instagram post to accompany the blog post as well.
We never talked about where we wanted to start.
I think we should start with the Schoenfeld piece, which is, it's not only about strength, but it does touch on strength. And I think it provides a pretty good, like, it challenges some things that most people are taught at the beginning of their learning about strength and conditioning journey, but it does like save some takeaways that are still true, even if some of the stuff we believe is kind of messed up.
Sure, go for it.
I got the study open, so I'll just look at it here. It's Schoenfeld and colleagues. It is from almost exactly a year ago, like a year and 1 week ago. Titled Loading Recommendations for Muscle Strength, Hypertrophy, and Local Endurance, a Re-Examination of the Repetition Continuum. So basically, a lot of you have probably seen the chart that shows from like 1 to 5 reps is strength, from 6 to 12 reps is hypertrophy, and more than that is muscular endurance. And maybe the fancier one where they blur together or whatever. And they did a meta-analysis to really dig into, is it true, or I guess less of a meta-analysis and more of like a review of the existing literature,
Which is a meta-analysis.
Yeah, but like without the formal part where I don't think this, I was reading it really briefly really recently, and I don't think there was the deliberate process of
Meta-analyzing,
like screening criteria and things like that for what got included. It was more of like a narrative review.
Fair enough.
So they come out the gate pretty critical on that model, which I think both of us have probably like let go of that model to a certain degree. And in the hypertrophy realm, for sure, you kind of have to throw out that chart. You can kind of get hypertrophy in really any range, and it depends on whether you equate for total volume and all sorts of that stuff. But this episode is not about hypertrophy, so I'm not going to worry about that much. The takeaways on strength on this one are that, yes, the percentage of 1 rep max you use to train with matters, and like heavier loads are going to be a little more optimal for strength outcomes, but that gets fuzzier as soon as you start talking about like different populations and different goals
And training age.
Also true. So like the more trained the person is, the more the load is going to matter. It doesn't matter nearly as much in untrained individuals, according to them. And one that I found really interesting, because most studies train people on a movement and then test people on that movement. And they started to look into, does it still matter when you train people on a movement and then test them on something that movement should theoretically carry over to, but is not identical. And so one of the examples they use is like training people with like traditional barbell resistance training stuff, but then testing them on some kind of isometric test. And as soon as you like slightly adjust the way it's assessed, because obviously most people listening to this are hopefully trying to train to apply it to something real life rather than just powerlifting or something like that, where you're training for the actual exercise. But the percentage of 1 rep max you train with matters a whole lot less if you're trying to apply the strength gains to a task that's not that exact lift.
I mean, it makes sense when you think about it.
To me, it comes down to like strength adaptations are largely neurological, and there's like a huge amount of specificity when you're working at like really high end percentage of 1 rep max of a specific movement, where you're like just getting better at like that particular movement to a really high degree.
Well, and as well, you got to think of like strength as being, I mean, there's a sports specific component of strength, I would argue, when we think about it traditionally from a strength and conditioning context, which is powerlifting, which is maximal expression of strength. So in that case, like the traditional spectrum thing would arguably make sense, because the closer you train to that max, the more specific you're effectively being for your sport. So if strength for you is like being strong across 5 reps, then to your point, like the specificity component outweighs the absolute, 1 rep, 2 rep, 3 rep, whatever. And hypertrophy, same way. Like it's less about, and this is kind of, to me, it falls along the same argument that we make about heart rate zones, where it's like nothing magical happens between 136 and 137 beats per minute. Similarly, nothing magical happens between like 10 reps and 11 reps, where your body just like, oh my God, we're doing muscle endurance now. It's specific to the physiological response that you're creating through the muscle tension piece, which comes from the load that you're lifting, and then the energetics piece, or the bioenergetics piece, which comes from the metabolic byproducts you're creating due to the fatigue you're building up. And I recognize we said at the outset we weren't going to dive down rabbit holes, and here we are.
Yeah, I almost went down a rabbit hole, because one of the pieces I read before we did this that I did not put on our notes sheet because I do not want to go down that rabbit hole was all about like the various things that are happening inside your body that may or may not lead to strength adaptations. But it's worth noting that like you can't draw too many assumptions from like causal theories, right? A lot of the literature looked at brief changes in hormone levels immediately after training. So like transient changes in hormone balance after training. And then a big assumption is made that that is a causal factor for gaining muscle mass or gaining strength or something like that.
Correct.
But once you start to like actually look at whether it does that, things get a lot fuzzier really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think all that is to say that like there's a specificity component to this, and there's a whole heap of science and physiology that you could dive into if you really wanted to understand what's happening in the background. Do you feel like we touched on Schoenfeld well?
I think so.
Okay.
Do we want to go into like minimum effective dose, optimal dose stuff before we go into like actual programming?
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay. I thought these were interesting. It's 2 different studies. First one, much more recent, looking at minimum effective dose for strength. And it looked at a whole bunch of studies, tried to narrow it down. And thankfully, this doesn't happen a whole lot in like published literature. They like actually state a recommendation, like what they came to as a team of like, this is the bar that meets our criteria. And it comes out to a single set of 6 to 12 repetitions with loads in the 70 to 85% 1 rep max range, 2 to 3 times a week. And we're going to come back to this last part, but the last part is with high intensity of effort. And that'll matter in some of the conversations we're going to have in a second, the intent you bring when you're lifting. But when you think about this, 2 to 3 sets, 6 to 12 reps per week is enough for novice and intermediate to like still be progressing, not just maintaining. That's enough of a dose to see progression, unless you're like pretty highly trained, and you might have to go a little higher than that. And I think that's something we miss, is like how low the total volume requirement is to like see good adaptation response.
And this type of stuff is important to consider, especially when you start getting into like conversations around concurrent training and hybrid training. And because that's always the question is like, what's the minimum amount of work I can do across all these disciplines so that when I mash it all together, I'm not just like destroying myself. So the case that this study makes would be the numbers that you laid out. And I think for me, and I mean, I remember when this paper came out, and there's another paper done by the same guy with another team that looked at the same kind of thing, minimum effective dose for 1 rep max strength in powerlifters. It's good stuff that they're looking at, but less specifically the numbers and more just the concept, like you mentioned. It's the dosage is way, way lower than I think a lot of people think that it should be. And so instead of getting into like a tizzy because you're trimming sets across the week as you try to incorporate more training volume, just understand that like the floor for this is much lower than you're probably realizing it is. So you can open up a lot more training volume to do other things, basically, is what I'm getting at.
I think there are probably a lot of people out there like that think that more is better, and that's why they're doing so much, and they haven't really evaluated the results they're getting. I know,
Yes,
like
big time.
the experience for me in my like I've talked before about like the journey everybody has to go through. Like nobody skips all the steps. So like if people who knew me a few years ago, I was a 531 fanatic for a brief period there,
Oh,
and
cheeky.
hey, and part of it was the realization like when I first went on it, I found myself following the program, and part of following the program had me doing a lot less volume than I was used to. I wasn't training as many days per week as I was used to, and I was doing less in those sessions than I was used to in terms of like total amount of stuff I did in the gym. And I was getting stronger a lot faster than I had been before. Pretty cool. And this is not me trying to sell 531. It's part of the journey that everyone goes through.
There are other strength programs out there. We're not
Everybody
sponsored.
goes through their German volume training phase. Everybody goes through their 531 phase. Like there's just like phases you have to experience. That's
Shout
just
out Smolov phase if you've
right.
ever done Smolov.
But it's the like I haven't figured out a good way to like present it on social media. It's something I kind of want to figure out how to do on the Instagram. But like if you could train less and get better results, would you? And I think if people were honest, they might struggle with that question a little bit because a lot of people are just training from like trying to crush themselves for some like psychological reason. I don't know.
Well, but I think too, like, and you mentioned this, if you do train quote unquote less, like if the volume is low, the intent and the intensity need to be higher. And so
Yeah.
like you could do 2 sets during the week at like RPE 9 or whatever, but like a real life RPE 9 is very, very hard. So there is that trade-off of like, yes, you can trim the volume, but then the intent and the intensity have to be there. And that's something that requires a little bit of a gut check of like, the set of 15 freaking shoulder raises that I'm doing, like, is that actually doing anything? Are you taking that to such an extent that you're eliciting the response you're after? Or are you just doing that as like a fluffer exercise because you think that you need that much volume?
We're circling around the idea of intent with strength training. Do we want to just talk about it?
Sure.
We'll come back to the optimal part. But this is we were talking about this before hitting record, and it's something I've noticed is that people who are farther along in their journey than I might be, maybe I'm coming to this chapter of my journey, but people who've been in the like strength and conditioning world for a long time, train themselves a lot, all that stuff, they all end up talking a lot about how important intent is when you're doing resistance training. So not necessarily the amount of weight on the bar, but like the intent to apply a lot of force, the intent to make it move and move quickly.
Make the plates rattle.
And it's interesting to me that like regardless of the background they came from, whether it was sport, whether it was tactical, whether it's powerlifting, whatever, like all different backgrounds of people end up kind of funneling towards this like idea that one of the foundational criteria when you're doing resistance training is intent. And yet it's so rarely talked about for people who are earlier in that journey. Everything is about sets and reps.
Yes. I mean, yeah. To elaborate, basically, again, with RPE, I think RPE is a good example of this, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I like RPE so much is that if you're honest with it and you do it the right way, the intent is kind of baked into it. If you're honest with the reps in reserve concept and you're doing an RPE 8 or 2 reps in reserve and you lift the weight, you do the squats to the point where you legitimately only have 2 reps in reserve because that's what you're following on your program, then the intent is kind of baked into that. And you could always take it a step further and get into some like the biopsychosocial stuff that we talked about with like Kylie. But I think for the purposes of this discussion, if you're doing, like I just mentioned, sets of 15 or whatever on the shoulder raise, by the time you get to that 15th rep, it should be the hardest rep you've done of that set. Like that should be an RPE 10 or a 9 or whatever the prescription says, versus just flapping your arms for 15 reps because that's what it says on the sheet. Like there's a difference in those two approaches.
And I think it makes sense. This is something I think we've talked about in previous episodes, but it helped me understand what you're trying to do with different types of programming. When the goal is to improve like aerobic capacity or endurance or things like that, you're mostly looking at like physiological adaptations, like metabolic adaptations, your body's efficiency. When you're talking about resistance training and strength goals, you're talking mostly about neurological adaptations. So like your brain's ability to recruit motor units. So it makes sense then that intent basically being your like brain's involvement in trying hard is going to be a huge factor in the results you get. You are training yourself to try hard more than anything else. Yes, other things are happening in terms of muscle mass, muscle strength, muscle fibers, bone density, whatever, all sorts of other cool things. But the biggest factor, the one that is going to determine the most of the results, is the neurological piece.
Yeah, I mean that requires heavy loading, and the other thing too is like just being used to putting heavy weight on your back or picking it up off the ground or whatever the motion is, which becomes important too when we get into some of the stuff that we may uncover later, like the lower RPE approaches and working up to heavy top sets. Like the reasoning for that is because you do have to have exposure to that heavier load for the reasons you just explained.
Yep. And the cool thing, because we're about to move into other stuff, is that some of this stuff sounds complicated and all like the weird anatomy, physiology nonsense. The cool thing is that the earlier you are in this process, like the lower your training age, the less any of it matters, especially for beginners. Everything will work out.
Everything works. Some things work better. Yeah.
Cool. I'll quickly go over the optimal one. I was hoping to find, and like I should have known going into this that you're not going to find like a clear answer on like the right amount for everyone, because that doesn't exist. There is some stuff out there on like optimal loading. Granted, so the study I tracked down is from 2004, so it's a little bit older, but it is like still a well-respected study, still cited in modern stuff a lot. Nothing has really like challenged this claim. So I'll explain like what they came to in terms of optimal, but then I'll explain why I don't think it's necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer.
And I just real quick point out that in 2004, the number one hit single was "Yeah" by Usher.
Okay. So take everything with a grain of salt. There you go.
Well, that was a good song.
I should probably name the authors so they can get a little credit here. Maximizing strength development in athletes, a meta-analysis to determine the dose-response relationship by
These
Peterson,
will all
Ray,
be
and Alvar.
these will be in the show notes, by the way.
Oh yeah, this is gonna be a show notes heavy episode.
Mm.
But what they came to was maximal strength gains are elicited among athletes who train at a mean training intensity of 85% of 1 RM, 2 days per week, and with a mean training volume of 8 sets per muscle group. So the previous one said 6 to 12 reps, 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group. This is a little bit more than that. You're still talking about like the 2 times per week range. They were on the heavier end of the 70 to 85% range, and there were more sets per muscle group. But it's worth noting that this meta was done because there was a lot of evidence in untrained and recreationally trained people, and they wanted to see how it played out in highly trained people. And as kind of expected, it was towards the higher end of the percent 1 RM and towards the higher end of the volume stuff compared to those less trained populations. But the population they're looking at, we cannot extrapolate this to everyone because they were looking at exclusively collegiate, professional, and elite athletes. Looking through the studies that met the inclusion criteria, the most common was football. No shocker there. Some other ones that popped up a few times were rugby, basketball, Olympic lifting. I went in cynical. I didn't think there'd be a lot of endurance stuff. There were some where it was like concurrent training style stuff and endurance. I saw cross country skiing and cross country running in there. So it is a decently diverse population of different types of athletes and stuff, but certainly more on the strength and power sports side of the world. Lots of football kind of stuff and highly trained athletes.
As is the way. Football.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's good. Like, again, most of the things that we've referenced so far have been meta-analyses or that style of work, which I think is important to point out, because on their own, there are a lot of studies out there that claim certain things, like this is the right number of sets, reps, whatever. I think it's important to point out that, like, what that really means is that's the right number for the people that were represented in that study. So by putting all of them together and looking across the board at the different types of athletes you mentioned, like, you do make a broader case to say that this is probably what right looks like. I would caveat that by saying, and we mentioned this in one of our earlier episodes, I think, with some of the programming stuff, like, if you build a program effectively so that the work you put in kind of signals what right looks like, like you're tracking your estimated 100 max or whatever, and it's going in the right way, you may find that what is quote unquote optimal for you is slightly different from this study, which I know you just mentioned, but I think it's important to, like, double tap, because you do see some folks read these types of things and say, okay, this is what it needs to be. And then they add that kind of puzzle piece to their program, and it becomes a little bit confusing because you're trying to base everything off of what the study says versus what your programming is telling you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do we want to now transition to a little more X's and O kind of stuff, or do we have more foundation to lay?
No, I think that was good. I think, pat ourselves on the back for not getting too nerdy with that and diving into too many rabbit holes. Unless maybe we did without realizing it. But yeah, like we talked about at the beginning, the goal here is to basically build a strength program. And we went back and forth on this and kind of planning this episode, because we do advocate, I think, both of us more for kind of hybrid stuff, concurrent stuff. And do we speak to that style of training, or do we just speak specifically to strength? And so I guess I'll put out a couple of caveats here at the beginning. We're talking about this through the lens of strength training on its own, which is not to say that programming this way does not allow room for endurance. It's just not necessarily specifically how I would go about it. Having said that, we will probably touch on some tweaks that we could make to allow for more endurance volume, if you wanted to change a couple of things.
Yeah, because the point we made up front was that the dose you need to see good strength adaptations is lower than most people think. And just to underline what Drew said at the time, that's really good news if you're somebody who wants to be strong and fast, right? Because if the dose required for strength adaptations is lower, then you don't have to spend as much of your adaptation currency on strength training. You have more to spend on other types of training, like endurance stuff.
Yeah. And the other caveat I will point out, just a CYA, is that there's a bajillion different ways to program for strength. Like, it's undoubtedly the most talked about, debated, discussed aspect of strength and conditioning. So in an attempt to keep things relatively simple, we're going to talk through this using a template or a model or an approach that I've used for years and years, which is the heavy, light, medium approach, which I discovered this through a coach named Andy Baker. The name will be familiar for folks that have come from a Starting Strength world. He was the co-author of Practical Programming with Mark Ripito. He admittedly kind of borrowed or modified this from a guy named Bill Starr, who was a football strength and conditioning coach, and wrote a book, which is awesome, called The Strongest Shall Survive. It's like an old school football training manual. So if you're a Westside guy, you'll recognize some of this stuff. If, like I mentioned, if you're a Starting Strength guy, you'll recognize some of this stuff. And I don't want people listening to this screaming at their Spotify, like, you're talking about Louis Simmons. It's like, well, I know a lot of this stuff is coming from kind of the same origin. So heavy, light, medium is kind of the construct that we will use. And then we'll lay out basically a template that folks can kind of build from as they look to do their own strength training program.
Deal. Do you want to start by like defining the framework of it? You alluded to it when you talked about where it came from and stuff, but do you want to lay it down for people who haven't all spent a lot of time reading old school strength and conditioning
We
books?
don't seek out old school strength and conditioning books. Yeah. So the way that this is built is, and when I have like a notebook in front of me because this is how I would do it if I were programming for somebody, is it's with squatting, pushing, and pulling. So again, kind of your classic powerlifting approach to strength training. Surprise, surprise. Within those three movement patterns, you've got a heavy effort, a light effort, and a medium effort, hence the name heavy, light, medium. So there's different ways you can go about selecting movements, and I'll talk about two of them specifically. The first one is if you are wanting to be very, very sport specific. So let's say powerlifting, you want to squat, bench, and deadlift. In that case, as a starter, the only movements you would do, for example, the squat pattern would be back squat. And then on your heavy day, it would be a higher percentage of your 1 rep max. On your medium day, it would be a slightly lower percentage. And then on your light day, it would be the lightest percentage. Similarly, with your push, you would do bench press. And then with your pull, you would deadlift. So that's the one way to do it from like a sport specificity standpoint. The other way, and this is the way that I think, I don't want to say it's
Makes
better.
more sense for normal humans.
Yeah. Makes more sense for a normal human. Makes more sense for people who want to have a little bit of variety in their program.
I was reading some other stuff as we prepped for this, and I forget who was talking about it, but they differentiated between people whose entire goal in life is to make heavy circles move and people who have other goals.
People who have other goals. So the alternative approach, and again, this is the one that I would probably advocate for, is to select movements that automatically fall into heavy, light, and medium categories. So for example, with the squat pattern, the heaviest, arguably, squat movement that you could do would be a back squat. A medium-ish relative to a back squat might be a front squat. And then a light version might be like a split squat is one that I've used a lot. Deadlift, same concept. The heavy one would be the deadlift. Medium could be a Romania deadlift. And then light could be, a kettlebell swing. I've even done, pull-ups as the light variation. And then with pushing, bench press, medium could be a push press or a power clean if you want to get crazy with it. And then light could be a strict press. So
wait, I got confused there.
I just realized I said power clean for push.
Yeah,
that was wrong. Heavy bench press, medium might be a push press, light might be a strict press.
Okay,
or an incline bench. Yeah, no, that was totally on me. The point is, when I start doing these things and when I write out these programs, I legitimately will set up a grid, like a 3x3 grid, where you've got squat, push, pull down on the left side, and then across the top, heavy, light, medium, or heavy, medium, light, however you want to do it. And then you fill in the boxes with the exercises that you want to go with.
I do like that we've stumbled into something that I've tried to hammer a few times. I
have power cleans. Power cleans are not a push.
No, but since we're speaking to a largely tactical professional type of audience here, I have this dream because in the tactical world, everything comes down to checklists. If you can't put it on like a checklist and laminate it and fit it in a cargo pocket, it's not going to happen. And so I have this dream of a checklist style how to program strength and conditioning. And one of the ones I've been a huge advocate for is here's a list of movement patterns. I want you to touch all of them at least once every week.
There you go.
What you've talked about is switching from being overly concerned with 3 specific exercises, aka squat, bench, deadlift, and instead transitioning to movement patterns that you can select exercises, a variety of them that all attack the same pattern, but are a little different.
Yeah. And again, like I'm using squatting, pushing, and pulling, or we'll call it knee flexion, pushing, and pulling, because in the context of this
that a knee bending reference?
Yeah, exactly.
You're a squat-over guy now?
Absolutely not. In the context of this program, that's what is used. That is not to say that those are the only 3 movement patterns before people get on me about like farmer's carries and like gait. Like, yes, there are more than 3 movement patterns, but for the purposes of this, we're focusing on those 3. So step 1, we just kind of touched on, which is the exercise selection piece. You've got your 3 patterns. You've got your heavy variant, your medium variant, and your light variant. So now it gets a little bit more complex. with regards to how we shape the week. So again, I'm looking at another grid, 3x3 grid. Across the top, I have my 3 days, in this case, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It doesn't have to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but for the purpose of keeping this easy, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then across the left side, I've got heavy, medium, and light. So I realized that I called this program heavy, light, medium, and that is what it's called. But when we put the session together, and this should make sense to people that have put sessions together before, typically you want to work from your heaviest effort down to your lightest effort. Like your highest intensity takes the most out of you, down to your least intense effort. So
do you want me to touch on the study I was looking at about that specifically?
Absolutely.
So it may matter as you get into like more and more specificity and like later into your training age and trying to push the envelope a little bit more. But as I was perusing some research before recording this episode, there's a decent amount of evidence that what Drew just laid out, which is like common sense in the strength and conditioning world, like do your compound heaviest stuff first and do your like isolation lightest stuff last and all that kind of thing. But there's like a decent body of literature saying that probably doesn't matter that much either.
I think I probably agree with that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Only because I've seen it play out to where like what I just said makes the most sense. Like people turn it on its head and they do just fine.
That's the takeaway. It's not that like it's better or worse. It turns out it's just not as big a factor as people might lead you to believe.
Yes.
It's insignificant in most cases.
But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to go heaviest to lightest. So
there we
go. As you were. So just to reiterate, across the top, and if you're, taking notes along as I'm doing this, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then heavy, medium, light for our kind of 3 segments of each session. So this is where it can get a little bit weird if you're just listening. So for Monday, the heavy, and I just do this just by habit. Like I have the heavy squat as the first block on Monday. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's how I've done it here. So you go from the heaviest lift to the lightest lift back to medium. So the argument there is that the first day of the week, you're crushing that movement pattern. The following exposure to that movement pattern would be light to allow some recovery. And then the follow on would be medium because you're ramping back up to heavy. So effectively what that means across the week would be, that first exposure on Monday to the heavy knee flexion is your heavy squat. And then on Wednesday, we go light with the squat. It falls later in the session. And then on that Friday, we go with a moderate squat effort that falls in kind of the middle of that session. Similarly, if Wednesday, for example, becomes our heavy push, Friday is the light push. Fast forward to Monday, because that would be the third exposure of the following week, is the medium push. If this is getting like super confusing, stop me, because I have explained this to people before and they're like, sorry, what?
I think I could be wrong here. It seems like the opposite of confusing, and it seems like you might be over explaining it.
Maybe I am, and maybe that's intentional. So in an attempt to continue to over explain, if Friday is the heavy push, the following exposure, Monday, would be the light push, and the following exposure after that, Wednesday, would be the medium push. So if you do that in a grid, you end up with 3 days of strength work with 3 blocks each day, a heavy block, a medium block, a light block. Each one of those blocks has one of the following: knee flexion, pushing, and pulling. Ta-da.
You're rotating all the things. You're rotating the exercises.
You're rotating all the things.
And you're rotating the intensities.
And if you thought that was confusing, just wait. So we'll take this Monday session that we've created and we'll kind of tease out what that looks like. So again, we've got ourselves a heavy squat, a medium push, and a light pull, just by nature of the rotations that you just talked about. So if we assume that the back squat is the heavy squat that we want to do, that becomes part A. In this example, I've made up an incline bench press as my medium push, sorry. So that becomes part B. And then part C, my light pull, I've just made up pull-ups. And again, I think the magic here is in the exercise selection, like we talked about. That's where you can really get creative with what you think makes the most sense for your context.
Because remember, the original version of this uses the same exact exercises
over and over.
If you go back to his like Starr Baker kind of stuff, it's like this one was just squat, bench, power clean every day. Mm-hmm. Like you don't vary the exercises, you vary the percentage of max you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
But like to reinforce what he said, what we have done here is not have like changes in intensity of the same exercise. We have different exercises of similar movement patterns that by their nature are heavier or lighter.
Yes. And the important thing to point out there, if you're going to go this direction of exercise variety and allowing the exercise to dictate heavy, light, or medium, it has to be done with maximal intent. So if we say, for example, incline bench press in this case, like that's our medium lift, we're still going to be putting in maximal effort on that lift, but because it's inherently lighter than the quote unquote heaviest press we could do, which might be the bench press, it becomes that kind of medium variation. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, kind of chew on it for a second. I think maybe a cleaner way of explaining that would be if we say that the deadlift is our heaviest pull, then a pull up, even done as heavy as you could possibly do, is not going to be as heavy as your heavy deadlift. So it becomes your light variation. So that's the session we've arrived at. We did our exercise selection. We've got our heavy variation, our medium variation, our light variation of the three movement patterns. We walked through kind of what the week looks like, your Monday, your Wednesday, your Friday, and then how we kind of go through that heavy, light, medium rotation so that every movement pattern gets a heavy exposure, a medium exposure, and a light exposure in the same week. Check those boxes.
There we go.
Now it might get a little bit wonky because I think the next logical talking point would be how we tweak this to allow for different things.
I'm interested in what your tweak would be because I kind of know what my initial tweak would be.
So I'll talk through a couple of things. And so the way that I create sessions is not the only way to create sessions. Point that out first. Second of all, I add, and this is from just kind of like my early days in the tactical setting. And I think we talked about this early on in a couple of episodes. Like there's a propensity for people to like circuits and to like Metcons and to like that kind of stuff. So some of the things I'll touch on here will allow for that variety. But if I'm just looking at what we got to in the previous exercise, which was my back squat, my incline bench press, and my pull up. So A, B, and C. The first thing that I look to add to this, so if A1 is back squat, A2 for me in that superset, that primary movement superset, is some sort of prehab movement that complements the back squat. An example here might be, say you're doing 3 sets of back squat, and between each set, you're doing like a hip flexor stretch, or, input any mobility thing you want to do. Reason for that, well, there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is if you put it anywhere else, people are likely to skip it. And the second reason is if you superset a movement with something that forces them to slow down, you are automatically requiring that they rest. So you're basically tricking people into getting better.
And for those who haven't nerded out on some of this stuff, and Drew, correct me if I'm wrong if you've seen something different here, but from all the stuff I've looked at in terms of like interset rest, like how much time to rest between sets of the same movement or things like that, in almost every case, more rest is better. Now you get into a diminishing returns thing where you have to get your workout done in a reasonable amount of time and you have to get a reasonable amount of sets done in your workout. You can't rest forever. But I know early in my journey, it was all about like, oh, you got to like really constrain that rest time and get your work done super fast. And like, it was implied that was to maximize your gains. And that doesn't really bear out in the research. It's more to get more work done in the same limited workout time you have.
Yeah, I think a better way to say it wouldn't necessarily be more is better, because you do reach, like if you were to sit there for 20 minutes between sets,
Yeah.
you would lose.
Gotta stay warm.
Yeah, like you would lose a lot of the drive to do more sets.
Yeah.
But
in like that 2 to 3 minute range.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. And actually, I'm not even going to try to cite this because I'm going to screw it up. But I have seen where people have made the claim where rest can be auto-regulated, and that actually shows some good return on investment. So essentially, and I do this with people all the time, I don't specify an amount of rest. I let them kind of choose that. And what I have found is that more often than not, and I think some of this comes back to training age, like they tend to fall into that kind of 2 or 3 minute time range.
I believe it.
I will point out, since we're talking about rest, like I have seen this with myself and with others, where if you set a timer, it actually becomes a little bit more fatiguing because you start to stress over the countdown, and that inadvertently kind of creates a situation where you are in a heightened state of, I don't want to say like fight or flight, but like you're just in a heightened state of awareness, and that can lead to some residual fatigue that makes the follow-on sets harder. So
I believe that too. I will say though, this is going in the exact opposite direction. Just having been around army gyms a lot, the most problematic thing I see is the sheer amount of time people spend on their phones
yeah,
when they're theoretically working out. Like I know you're not supposed to like pay attention to how much weight other people have in the bar or what they're doing or whatever, but I'm always curious about like what's going on in the gym, like how people are training. And I have seen people come in and do like a set of an exercise and then like play around on their phone for like 10 minutes and then like put it away and go do a single set of another thing.
yeah, don't be
And
that
I,
guy.
I see this most often with people who are like explicitly training for like the events of the ACFT around army gyms. And they'll theoretically be at the gym for like an hour, but over that hour, they did 2 or 3 standing power throws, a single rep of the sprint drag carry, and like 1 or 2 sets of deadlift. And they're going to tell people they were at the gym for an hour. And they were physically inside of a gym for an hour, but they did not accomplish very much. So like, yeah, like a little more rest might be smart in certain cases when you're training with strength as your end goal within reason, guys. And I think there's a time dilation effect where when you're staring at your phone, time passes faster than you're realizing it's passing. So I don't know. No, people don't have to follow my nerdiness, but I try to avoid bringing my phone with me into the gym at all because I find I get better workouts when I'm not distracted, but that's a separate issue.
Well, I think to put a bow on it, if you were just to do this like prehab superset concept, which to be clear, I did not make up, but if you structure it that way, I think a lot of these things take care of themselves.
That's fair.
So just to kind of, in this example, and I'll use 3 sets of 5 as just an arbitrary number. In this example, we have 3 sets of 5 on the back squat, and then we're supersetting the squat with a hip flexor stretch, or, insert the mobility thing of your choice. It's a great way to sneak in some stuff. It's a great way to loosen up some range of motion. Believe what you will about static stretching. Like, I think some of it is placebo, and that's fine. But if you feel like it opens you up a little bit, then great, cool, throw it in there. So that's A. That's the primary lift that we've come in to do. That's like the focus of our session. Moving on to B, this is what I would call kind of like your accessory or your successories. Shout out Chris McNamara. Your successories here for part B. So if you're keeping track and taking notes, in this case, we've got our incline bench press. And then what I like to superset here, if I'm going to do a superset, and we'll go in a couple different directions with this. If I've got enough time to train and I'm doing an A and a B and a C, my B with this incline bench press, I might throw in an accessory movement or a successory movement that supports that squat. Again, questions can be raised about total volume and all that kind of thing. Fair points. But if you wanted to throw in like a split squat or something that's going to complement that movement pattern, you could do it here as an accessory to the medium press, which is our incline bench press. The other thing you could do if you're short on time, and I've done this before too, is back to that heavy, medium, light construct. The medium and the light for the day can be done as a superset, which basically leaves you with 2 supersets. You're in and out of the gym, 30 to 45 minutes tops. That's an option too. I think my larger point here is that you've got options.
I do. That's actually another one I've wanted to slap together for like the social media audience is a super simple like weekly routine that involves only supersets, like only 2 of them per workout, but hits all the motor patterns you need to hit, and therefore gives you like all the strength work you would need for like a novice intermediate type of person in like 2 to 3 20 to 40 minute like real fast workouts, because I think that could absolutely be accomplished in an effective way.
Totally. Speed round. Pew, pew.
Yeah.
So part B, again, we've got our incline bench press, we've got our accessory lift. we haven't really spoken much about like reps and sets yet, or maybe at all, but typically for me, like part A is going to hover around like an RPE of 8. And then part B is where you could kind of ramp things up a little bit to like an RPE of 9, because again, it's typically a little bit lighter. The idea is to support a primary movement, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So talking about like the rep continuum and that kind of thing, like the reps can usually be a little bit higher here. This can be where you do kind of your bodybuilding type stuff. You get into some kind of metabolic fatigue, some pump that can kind of fall in the B range. So then C in this case,
You just tempted me with a rabbit hole.
you can come back to it if you want to.
I don't. At some point, I have not done enough reading to know whether pumps matter in terms of the results you get, because I see tons of
They
stuff
matter,
like,
Alex.
Like if I take this supplement, I get higher quality pumps.
Pumps.
And I like, yeah, cool. I love pumps, but like, does it matter? I don't know.
I think so. And I will shout out Evan Pike on here. We had him on forever ago. Look at a lot of his stuff, because the pump that you're feeling is just a buildup of metabolic byproducts as you vasoconstrict blood flow to your
Which
muscles.
Are a factor in the results you get, but they're
right.
not
they're
factor.
not the factor in hypertrophy, but it could be a factor. And the hypertrophy research, like we said, we don't want to touch on that because there's a million ways you could go with it. But there's an argument to be made that building up metabolic byproducts is kind of an end around for achieving hypertrophy. Ipso facto, it's a lack of oxygen in the muscle and an increase in metabolic buildup that creates the pump.
But note that he's talking about hypertrophy right now and not strength. And
exactly.
This episode's about strength.
And as you mentioned, it was a rabbit hole and we went down it. So thank you. Okay. So back to part C. So again, just to reiterate, A1, back squat, we superset that with a prehab movement. For part B, we threw in our medium lift. In this case, it was a push, incline bench press. And for funsies, we did an accessory that supported the squat. You could also do an accessory or a prehab movement that supports that push. So, banded internal, external rotation, whatever. If you're crunched for time, you could superset your medium lift with your light lift, which in this case is pull-ups, because that's our light pull. So we've done our exercise selection at the beginning. We've arrived now at building the session. We are at part C, which is the pull-up. This is where I deviate from the kind of traditional heavy, light, medium guys, because again, they're looking at this specifically through the lens of powerlifting. And in their examples, you would only do these main lifts. You wouldn't do anything else. Fair play. For me, and with tactical guys, part C is where you can have a lot of fun, throw in some timed work, throw in circuits, throw in whatever, while still adhering to the exercise selection grid that you set up earlier on in this example. So I have my pull up. Who's to say that I could not also throw in, a farmer's carry and a plank, and then I could make that, instead of 3 rounds, I could make it a 10-minute, for quality AMRAP type thing. That's one way to kind of keep yourself strict with a template, if that's the kind of thing you like to do, but still allow for some freedom so that the athlete, I would argue, has a little bit more fun. And if you've ever trained with me or done stuff that I've put together, you probably will recognize that format, because I revert to it quite a bit.
I'm trying to come up with a good name for your format, because it, just like heavy, light, medium, it has the 3 phases, but instead of heavy, light, medium, it's more like heavy pump Metcon.
Well, the heavy pump Metcon template is one that we've, if you look back in the ancient texts from the Greeks, Sophocles actually laid out the heavy pump Metcon. No, but yeah, that is true. And again, like, we'll put all of this in the show notes, the stuff that we mentioned, Andy Baker, that he talks about. And he does a much better job than I do teasing a lot of these things out. He has some excellent FAQs on it where people ask, how could I shorten this? What if I wanted to do snatches and power cleans? What does that look like? The nice thing about heavy, light, medium, and the reason why I wanted to use heavy, light, medium as the lens through which we talked about strength is because it allows for a ton of creative freedom. If you wanted to, for example, do Olympic lifting, add in Metcons, do some hypertrophy. But we wanted to just give folks, here's where I would start in terms of exercise selection, and then how would I take that all the way to an actual session.
it's cool that you took heavy, light, medium and found like creative approaches. Because if you look at like Star's original heavy, light, medium stuff, it's extremely uncreative. It's like
It's uncreative.
it's like 5 by 5, but with your little grid thing, and that's it. And it's you
Well,
just like go up by 5 or 10% and down by 5 or 10%, and that's the whole thing.
credit to him. The reason he did that was because he was intentionally looking for a way to filter a lot of collegiate football players in the 60s and 70s through a weight room.
It's fair.
And so, and this is, I bought and read this book forever ago. Like, it's a really fun book to read, especially if you're into physical culture, because it just kind of gives you an idea of what guys were getting at forever ago, which is neat. He again, like in his, has like some Olympic lifts for like 5 by 5, which I think is a lot, but it's cool to kind of tease out where a lot of this came from. We mentioned sets and reps. Like, again, that is very, this could become its own rabbit hole. Like, it's very task specific. So if you wanted to bias a little bit more of like a strength adaptation, quote unquote, you would look at doing higher RPEs. You would probably look at doing lower reps. You don't have to, but that's where you might start. And if you find that it works for you, you could stay there and tweak things. For parts B and C, like you mentioned, you can get away with going a little bit higher on your reps because, again, these aren't the primary movers that we're after. But I think we did a good job, hopefully, of giving some of an overview about how to build out a program.
One thing that we didn't say explicitly, but showed up in like the example exercises you gave, is that one piece of the literature is very convincing, like across basically all of it. And that is that, especially when you're talking about minimum effective dose, where you're trying to get the maximum training effect with the least amount of stuff you got to do, compound movements are absolutely the way to go.
Yes.
Nothing like, I'm not saying you can't do curls or whatever. I do curls regularly. Curls are functional. But when you are trying to make the most out of limited training stuff, so this is now like, especially if we're talking about your training for a tactical population during like actual structured physical training time where your time is limited and you got to get the most out of it, I would absolutely preference compound movements basically for all of it.
Absolutely. And again, there's a ton of different ways you could set this thing up. You could stick with the same movements and adjust the loading. You could, in this example, which we did, which may have made things complicated, you can use different movements. But to just kind of like, I guess we can work towards a conclusion. To go really quickly, top to bottom, the way to do it, if you wanted to do heavy, light, medium, is to create that 3x3 grid across the top, heavy, light, and medium. And then across the left side, your movement patterns. In this case, we had the squat, the push, and the pull. Figure out the movements that you want to use. The next step is to lay out your week. So again, we've got a 3x3 grid, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Across the left, we've got the heavy movement, the medium movement, and the light movement. That's the order of the session. If you start with your squat pattern, the heavy block on Monday, the next exposure is light, and the exposure after that is medium. So just pull from your exercise menu that you created. Similarly with the push, you've got your heavy, then your light, and your medium. Same with the pull. If you do it correctly, you'll end up with 3 days. Each day has 3 blocks, a heavy block, a medium block, and a light block. Each movement pattern is covered once each day. And then from there, you just build out your session. So the example that we used had the primary lift superset with some sort of prehab rehab exercise. It had the medium lift superset with either an accessory movement, a prehab movement, or if you're crunched for time, superset with the light movement. If you do keep the light movement as its own thing, part C, why not have some fun with it? Throw in a couple of other, isometric core carry type stuff, put a timer, go to town. That to me is a pretty good way of setting up a strength session.
You know what I'm going to make you do after this?
Do the session.
No, we're going to turn this into an Instagram post too, because it actually lends itself really well to like being digestible visually.
Perfect. And you know what else? Because now that we have a website, we'll do a blog post too.
There we go.
And this is something, like I said, this will be a show notes heavy exercise because we are taking these concepts from different people. And I would love to point everyone into as many directions as we can so they can learn for themselves.
You know what you just did accidentally? The first official announcement of the website.
I would assume that by the time this comes out, we will have already announced it.
Yeah, but this is probably the first direct announcement on the pod.
It's a good point.
This episode probably won't come out for a few weeks. We got a pretty good body of content ready to go, but who knows?
Yeah, if you haven't listened to the episode that we haven't yet recorded, but we will record and probably publish before this one, we have a website. So you may have to edit all that out. Oh, man. So, yeah, I think that needless to say, there's going to be a lot of follow-on content for this. So people have some actual tangible things they can use. Yeah.
Cool.
Hey guys, Drew and Alex here. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in-depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.